Welcome to LSC, and it's sports time. I'm your host, Bob Hintz. Today I have a special guest from the Daily Press, Lynn Burke, who's been a sports writer. This is his 41st school year covering sports on the peninsula. Welcome, Lynn.
Bob, thanks for having me.
I tell you, it does my heart good to get a newspaper man in here who covers not just football, basketball, but all sports, and we're going to talk about all that thing. But when you first started in sports, we're going to go back to when you were in high school. And you grew up in where?
Grew up in Northwest Ohio, a little town called Deschler. About 2,000 people in the town. Was not an athlete. I was a student manager of the teams there. When I was a freshman in high school, a fellow started a sports page, the local weekly newspaper. Then he graduated, went on to college. I think he did it the first year in college, but then he decided it was too much. So I kind of inherited it. And I kind of gave me the impetus to maybe this is what I want to do in life. And I went to college at Ohio University, was a journalism major, got out of college, tried to find a job, spent the whole summer looking, didn't find anything. One day I was at the weekly newspaper office, saw a classified ad, no newspaper name, just a phone number to call. I called it, talked to Charlie Karmosky, the legendary sports editor at the Daily Press, talked to him 2 or 3 times on the phone, pretty much hired sight unseen. I had met him, he hadn't met me, until I walked in the office the first day.
Man, that's something. Well, you come from a small town. You had about 200 more people than I had in my hometown. We had 1,800 in a little small town in Iowa. So I understand. We had a weekly. It was the Index. It would come out once a week. And we had, the only time they had any sports was during the school year and did sports, and I'm assuming that's the same thing. So when you were in high school doing this, who mentored you? I mean, did you was a lot of hit and miss, or did you get a lot of it was on your own, or how did you come up with what you did?
Back then, most of it was on my own. I just pretty much made stuff up as I go. There were lots of hits. Well, probably lots more misses than hits back then. I was back in my hometown about 10 years ago for a memorial service for one of our high school coaches, and they had a display of old memorabilia and a lot of the stories that I wrote back then. Looked at him and said, I really can't believe that I wrote this, but that's what it was like back then. Until I got to college, there was no mentoring or teaching or anything like that. It was all self-learned.
Okay, so when you went to Ohio University and went into journalism,
yes.
What was that experience like? Because you're coming from what you did, just basically learning as you went, to now you're learning some structure.
From down here to way up here, all of a sudden, getting with professors who it was their job to teach you journalism, just a whole other world. It was great back then. It wasn't as much maybe hands-on experience as kids get today,
right?
But still was a lot of writing. The first writing course I took, a fellow, his name was Don Lambert. It was his first year as a college professor. He was a former newspaper reporter, and it was a 5-hour course. Some of the courses, the professors would lecture for 3 hours. People would write for 2 hours. We wrote for 5 hours. So
wow.
all we did was sit there and write and write and write and write. And he was a pretty hard critiquer as he went along. He knew what he wanted, and more or less he knew what we shouldn't be doing. And he was really, really good about it.
Okay, so now when you were writing, there was a certain style that he wanted you to do. You had to have a catchphrase in front to catch their attention and those sorts of things?
It was the old inverted pyramid that you hear about so much in journalism. He was just teaching us to write very, very basic stories. Nothing fancy, nothing with really much of a flair. Just learn the basics.
Right. Okay. And then what got you into sports? Was that because there was this only sports thing at the newspaper you went into? Because journalism, not just sports.
No, I love sports.
Okay.
My dad was a big sports fan, and he imparted it to my brother, and my dad was my high school principal. So he imparted it to my brother and I, just watching, really back then, watching baseball games. That was mostly what was on television back then. And as I got into college and got more and more into it, I was a student manager of the baseball team at Ohio U, very, very successful, got to the College World Series my senior year, and I just decided that I wanted to be a sports writer. And so the ads that I answered, most of them were for sports writing jobs, some were for news writing jobs, but
right.
Fortunately the one that I landed here was for sports writer.
So this has been your only job?
strange. My 41st school year here. Yeah, it's amazing.
That's just amazing. I want to test your memory a little bit about the athletes that really stand out in your mind. And I know, and we got to apologize because there's going to be some that's not going to get mentioned. But you and I were talking. You said I got 5 that I can pop right off my hand, and they're not all major sports.
Well, I was trying to anticipate what kind of questions you might ask on the way over here. I was thinking, suppose you asked me who are maybe the 5 best athletes you've seen. I figured since we're on the LSC in Hampton, let's go ahead and limit it to Hampton. But the 5 I came up with, and with apologies to all the other athletes out there who either they or their families are going to say, I should have been on that list. Allen Iverson, Ronald Curry, Lakeisha Frett, Francina McCrory, the great runner from Bethel, and a swimmer from Kecoughtan back in the early 90s, Kurt Jakimowski, who was as dominant as an athlete in his sport as we've seen around here in any sport.
And those all not only made an impression on you, but ended up going on and doing good in those particular sports.
You know, Iverson, NBA Most Valuable Player, still playing. Well, he's not playing in Turkey right now, but he intends to go back. Curry had a nice career in the NFL. McCrory's a potential Olympian. Lakeisha Frett in college at Georgia in the women's NBA. Now she's coaching. And Kurt Jakimowski was an All-American swimmer at either Georgia or Auburn. I just forget which, and was also in the Olympic trials. So yeah, all 5 of them had excellent post-high school careers.
Yeah. And you almost feel like that you get to know these kids too by writing about them, don't you?
Oh, it's amazing. Just you think of the number of athletes that have come out of, and what do we call it now, the 757?
Right.
But just out of the city of Hampton over the years, and because you write about them and read about them and see their videos and so forth, yeah, you feel like you do know them.
Now, did you get a chance to go into these particular athletes you said and other athletes to interview them for specific articles that you did and get to know them a little bit better?
I'm not sure I ever interviewed Kurt Jakimowski. I think I talked to him, and I'm not sure if I ever interviewed him. But the other 4, yes. Probably the most was Francina, because I was covering track most of the years that she was at Bethel, and got a chance to sit down and talk to her after meets and after her races and so forth.
Right. So, but you didn't do just football and basketball and track and swimming. You did all sports. You did golf and tennis. And
when I started out, the way they structured the high school beat was the people who covered the Peninsula District covered football, basketball, and then baseball. And we had others who did the other sports. And over the years, I think we were talking beforehand that I've done at least one of every sport, if not more.
Well, that's amazing. But now, when you were doing these sports and you got to see these athletes, it has to make you feel good to see these youngsters excel.
Oh, absolutely. It's fun, and it's not from here. It's just fun to go, say, to a state track meet and just see all the wonderful athletes from all over the state that play. Well, same thing in basketball, to go to a state tournament and see them. But it's really fun to see the local kids do well. And I've been working at the office on a list of people from here who have played professional football in one form or another, and I think it's well over 100.
That many.
This is NFL, AFL, some indoor football, some European football, things like that. It's well over 100 people.
Just in this area?
From Hampton, Newport News, Williamsburg, York County, Smithfield, and a couple other localities.
I would never have come up with 100.
I never would have guessed it either.
Yeah, it's just amazing. But there's been a lot of good athletes. We've been very, very fortunate. I know that when I first started in 1980 doing stuff with what used to be then WHCS, now it's
Right.
Channel 48 LSC, I just felt like I'm fortunate to be in this area to see the caliber of athletes, but also the caliber of coaching.
Oh my gosh! You look at the coaches in all sports, and again, I'm going to miss some. You got to start almost with Mike Smith.
Right.
He's got 419, I think, career victories. It's the 5th most in high school football history. Hampton has, I think, 768 or something like that. That ranks close to, if not in the top 10, close to the top 10 victories. We were talking earlier about Kozlowski, Dennis Kozlowski, football coach at Bethel. The run they've had at Phoebus with Bill D, with Stan Sexton, now with the assistants that have just stayed there forever. Walter Brower at Hampton just won his 500th basketball game. And it just goes on and on. Eddie Williams at Bethel's won so many state track meets. Kaz again with his track success. You know, and just going back and back and back. The Johnny Palmers, the Suey Eastons, just absolutely amazing. And the Bob Hintzes.
Well, I gave Walter some of those 500 wins. I told him.
A lot of coaches gave Walter a lot of wins.
But now, when you watching these things, and you had to be aware of the different rivalries that would pop up. There were, at one time it was Hampton Bethel, and then it was Bethel and Phoebus, and I'm talking football, and in basketball it could be Kickingham
Right.
and somebody else. But talk about some of the rivalries that you remember.
It's like they all revolve some way around Hampton High School. You know, back my first year here was the last year of the old Hampton Newport News football
Rivalry,
game. It was
yeah.
1970, last year that Newport News High School existed. And from all the research I've done, you know, back then it was, for the white athletes, it was Hampton High School and it was Newport News High School. Then it was Phoenix and Huntington, which is a rivalry, you know, unto itself. You know, Hampton and Newport News. Then all of a sudden, Bethel got really, really good in football. I think for 4 years in the 70s, was Bethel won a state championship, and none of this division stuff. They were the AAA state champs. Bethel, Hampton.
Right.
I mean, that became a great rivalry.
74, 75, 76, 77. Yeah.
Right. Sitting there, you know, watching the Bethel Hampton games, usually the last game of the season, you know, and a lot of times back then only the district champ went to the playoffs.
That's exactly
so
right.
it was the playoff bid was on the line also to see that. You know, then that kind of fizzled a little bit. Bethel dropped down, and of course Hampton was so dominant in the 90s with the Curry era. Then all of a sudden here comes 2000, and here's Phoebus becoming, you know, the big man down there, and you know, the Phoebus-Hampton rivalry. While Phoebus has won most of the games here recently, you know, Hampton came awfully close in the regional finals to knocking them off.
Right.
Phoebus had to throw a touchdown pass right near the end of the game, you know, to win that one.
Well, now you said something to me when we were
Yeah.
before. Tell me to say that again.
On
Somebody would ask you.
Well, on our message boards on hrvarsity.com, there's the unending argument of who's better, Hampton or Phoebus. My line is, if you want a program for all time, you know, Hampton going back to 1898, you can't beat Hampton. If you want a program for the last decade, you sure can't beat Phoebus. Just two great programs, Hampton for all time and Phoebus for the last 10 or 12 years.
Well, and this rivalry is what got us in existence.
Mm-hmm.
In 1980, we were Warner Cable. We were channel 29,
Mm-hmm.
and the first game we did was Hampton and Bethel.
Mm-hmm.
Because whoever won that,
Right.
went on to, but there was no playoff. I mean, they went on to the playoff, but not like what we have today.
Right.
So, you know, Don Musselman was the superintendent, and he says, do that game.
Yeah.
And the next year, he says, there's coming down those same two teams
Mm-hmm.
again. And he says, but we got to make sure we don't forget the other two schools, so we did a Kecoughtan Phoebus.
Right.
And then he says, why don't we do a game of the week?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking, man, I have fallen into it and come out smelling like a rose.
Yeah,
So,
and it's just developed from that. Now you have the local sports channel with 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
well, you know, people want to emulate what we're doing.
Yeah.
And we say, great, do it. But they can't because they don't have the archives that we've
Right.
got. And that makes a big difference.
Absolutely.
Scotty and that group has done such a great job in making sure that we have all the stuff that we have done forever,
Mm-hmm.
and they can show it 24/7 on LSC, and it really, it's great. What do you see as changes in sport, in all the different sports, since you first started?
I think the biggest thing I see is more specialization.
Okay.
When Marty O'Brien and I guess it was in 2003, 2004, did a summer project called the Best High School Athletes in this area's history, I was struck by back in the 50s and 60s, two that just come to mind. Leroy Keys, from great football player, athlete from Carver,
right.
was a 1,000-yard rusher in football, 2,000-point scorer in basketball, and a 24-foot long jumper in track. A couple years later, Earl Faison at Huntington, outstanding defensive end, tight end in football, 1,500-point scorer in basketball, 56-foot shot putter in track. You just don't see that these days because of the proliferation of AAU basketball, of showcase baseball, and things like that, where you might see somebody who'll play two sports, like John Tell Evans at Bethel a couple years ago, an outstanding running back, outstanding point guard, but they're very rare. And mostly kids nowadays, they pick their sport and they'll stay with it and pretty much try to play it the year round.
Yeah. And I think it really takes away. I talked to Danny Mitchell in here earlier, and we were talking about that you don't see the 3-sport athlete, and sometimes a 4-sport athlete, you just don't see that anymore.
No.
And I think it really takes away from the kids around us, because I used to, when I was coaching, I would say, I want you to play soccer, or I want you to run cross country, because there's a lot of carryover stuff that you can use to help you in the sport that you like the best.
Right. Now in basketball, you've got, once the high school year's over, the AAU programs start, there's the summer programs and the fall leagues. So the basketball players, they have the opportunity to play some sort of organized basketball year-round.
Yeah. Name some of the sports writers that came through 40 years ago when you first started.
When I first started, the sports editor at the Daily Press was Charlie Kromoski. And back then, it was 2 papers. The Daily Press was the morning paper. Times Herald was the afternoon paper. Nick Mayo was the Times Herald sports editor.
And they were in competition, weren't they?
We really competed against each other. They tried to beat us on stories. We tried to beat them on stories. We worked out of the same office. They were in there in the morning till about 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Then we would come in and have the office in the late afternoon and into the night while we were producing our newspaper.
Right.
I can remember one time we beat them on a story. Back in those days, we used to have these carbon things we did for photo assignments, and somebody left one out that somebody from Hampton was signing with somebody. We saw that, didn't know about it, and broke the story on them the next morning because they had left that piece of paper laying around on one of the desks.
Who else besides Mayo and Kowalski?
Well, when I first came to the paper, the high school writer was Ray Hebert.
I remember Ray.
The late great Ray Hebert.
Was real fond of him. He treated me so good.
He was one of the goods. Ray passed away about 10 years ago. For those watching who remember him, he was from New England, and all he had to do was open his mouth.
And you knew where he was from.
And you knew where he was from. Bob Moskowitz was one of our columnists at the time, along with Charlie Kromoski. Boy, I'm mixing people because at some point now we merged staffs.
Right, but that's okay.
Charlie Den, back in those days. Al Pierce, auto racing writer, who's in the International Motorsports Hall of Fame for his writing. He was on the Times Herald side, and then he became a friend because he joined the Daily Press when we merged.
You welcome him in.
Oh, absolutely. Gosh, guy who covered some high schools back then, Bob Mings, Bob Moskowitz. I think I mentioned him, was one of our columns. Just a ton of people.
We both talked about one who is now a lawyer, but wrestled for Bethel High School. I'm talking to Steve Forbes when he was going to law school.
Right. I believe, if I recall right, he was a state champion wrestler at Bethel back when they had the 98-pound class. Yes. Steve worked for the Times Herald, covered high school sports and so forth. And one summer, there was an American Legion baseball tournament up in Front Royal. I don't remember if it was a state tournament or it was a regional tournament, but Steve and I both went up there, rode up together, got to know each other, and just had a good time up there.
So you rivals, but yet
rivals, but friends.
Right.
And that's the way it is.
Yeah.
When you get out, away from here, you run into the writers from Richmond and Norfolk and stuff like that. Yeah, you're rivals, but you're also friends.
Right.
Because they're in the same boat that you're in.
What do you see as the future in journalism? Not just in sports, but in journalism, and it's not going to be the same as when you came in.
It's certainly not. Newspapers, the printed page is going to be de-emphasized. I mean, it's obvious that we've already have de-emphasized. We are much more oriented toward getting stuff on the internet, the web, our high school website, hrvarsity.com, Facebook, Twitter. Gosh knows what they're going to invent in the next 4 or 5 years. But if somebody was to ask me what should they do, you've got to be well-rounded. You have to be able to write, and you have to be able to deal with social media and whatever else comes up next.
All right. Finally, we're going to wrap this up.
Okay.
If you could take just an overall view of everything, and you wanted to talk to a kid, you go into a class, English class, and they want to talk to you about journalism. And you just told me what they all need to do, but what are some of the things that they have to have up here to be a good writer, sports writer, for example?
You need to know English. You need to know the English language. You need to be able to write. I've actually spoken to some journalism classes, and I've told them that. I said, even if you're not writing for your school paper or anything, just write. Just sit there and if you want to be a sports writer, watch a game on television, and afterwards, write it up. Just keep getting into practice.
Right.
the more you write, the better you're going to be. It's like anything. The more you do it, the better you're going to be. The more you write, the better you're going to be.
Okay. One last question.
Sure.
Are there somebody that you mentored or who mentored you that really sticks out?
Gosh, so many people over the years. Let me pick two of the guys who were there at the paper when I first got there. Charlie Kamoski is a sports editor, and Bob Moskowitz. Like I say, Charlie was the guy who hired me, and Bob's probably of the folks around it. And I talked to him a lot, and we've had some good conversations, some good discussions, some good arguments. But I'd say those two guys.
Well, I want to thank you so much. Thank you for tuning in to Sports Time here on LSC. I want to thank my special guest, Lynn Burke, for coming in and sharing with us what goes on down at the Daily Press and what's happening. And I want you to continue to tune in and watch LSC. I'm your host, Bob Hintz. Until next time.